Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling Dying by Arthur Schnitzler, published in the year 1894. It is a quiet story about two people in Vienna, about a promise given in a moment of the deepest closeness, and about the question of what remains of that promise when time grows short. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried into a spring that unfolds differently than expected. The evening was mild, and the warmth of the day still lay over the paths of the park. Marie walked beside Felix, her hand in his, and she spoke of the weeks that lay ahead of them. She wanted to go to the countryside in the summer. She already had a place in mind, a house with a garden and a view of the mountains. Felix listened and nodded, but he did not answer. She noticed only when she turned to him and saw his face. It was pale, and around his mouth there was a look she had never seen there before. She stopped and asked what was the matter with him. He said it was nothing. She should go on speaking. She spoke on, but the words came more slowly now, and the joy had vanished from them. They sat down on a bench at the edge of the path. Before them, children were playing, and somewhere further off a band was playing a piece that Marie knew. Felix looked straight ahead. Then he said that he had been to the doctor. Marie asked what the doctor had said, and Felix, without looking at her, answered that he had 1 year left to live. At first she did not understand him. She asked again, and he repeated it, calmly, almost matter-of-factly. A year. Perhaps a little more, perhaps less. The lung was affected, and there was no prospect of improvement. Marie sat there and felt how the music went on behind her, how the children went on running, how everything around her went on unchanged, while inside her something broke. Then she threw herself against him and wept. She wept for a long time, and Felix held her and stroked her hair, and in that moment he was the one who comforted. When she had calmed herself, she looked at him. Her eyes were reddened, and her voice was firm when she said that then she would simply go with him. Felix did not understand her at once. She said it again, more clearly. If he died, she would die too. She would not outlive him, not by a single day. Felix looked at her and said she should not say such a thing, but she repeated it, and she said it with a certainty that left no room for doubt. It was not a comfort she wished to offer him. It was a vow. In the first weeks that followed, they lived in a peculiar calm. Felix had given up his work, and the days belonged to the two of them alone. They rose late. They went for walks. They read aloud to each other. Marie cared for him with an attentiveness that had nothing strained about it. She arranged his pillows. She saw to it that he did not overexert himself. She brought him tea when he coughed. And Felix let it happen, grateful and without objection. Sometimes they sat at the window and looked down at the street, and then they spoke of things that lay far back, of their first meeting, of an outing in autumn, of a night when it had rained and they had both gotten wet and laughed about it. They were good hours. Felix felt almost well in these days. The cough came more rarely, and once he said to Marie that perhaps the doctor had been mistaken. Marie said, of course he had been mistaken. Doctors were mistaken all the time. And Felix smiled and believed her for an afternoon. His friend Alfred came by regularly. Alfred was a doctor, still young, and he had examined Felix before the other one had. He spoke of the illness with a matter-of-factness that did Felix good, for it allowed him to remain matter-of-fact himself. Alfred said the climate was decisive. Felix must get away from Vienna, to the south, to the mountains. Somewhere the air was better. He named Murano. He named Lake Garda. Marie listened and began at once to make plans. They would travel, she said. They would be away the whole summer. Felix watched her while she spoke and noticed something that touched him strangely. She was alive. She had red cheeks when she spoke of the journey. She was full of plans. She was 22 years old and healthy. The thought came to him without warning and without his having summoned it. She will still see all of this. She will see the mountains and the lake and the years afterward. He pushed the thought aside. But in the evening, when she slept and he lay beside her and listened to her even breathing, the thought came back. He heard how calmly she breathed, how lightly, how naturally. And in him sat something tight, tenacious, that he did not want to name, and that kept him awake until the first gray at the window. They traveled at the beginning of June. The train carried them south, through valleys and over passes, and Marie sat at the window and pointed to every village, every waterfall, every ruined castle. Felix looked out and said little. In Murano, they found a room in a house on the hillside with a balcony and a view over the vineyards. The air was warm and dry, and in the first days he felt better. He got up in the morning without a weight on his chest. He could walk the path to the promenade without stopping. Marie was happy. She brought back flowers. She learned the names of the mountains. She talked recipes with the landlady. In the evenings, they sat on the balcony, and the crickets were loud, and above the peaks there stood a light that lingered a long while. Then came a setback. It began with a fever that rose one night and stayed for 2 days. Felix lay in bed, drenched, and the cough returned harder than before. Marie did not leave his side. She changed the cloths, she held his hand, she slept in an armchair beside the bed. When the fever fell, Felix was weaker than before, and he knew that he would not walk the path to the promenade again. From that day on, something changed between them. Felix began to watch Marie. He saw how in the morning she stepped to the window and felt the sun on her face. He saw how she reached for her food at the table, with appetite, with pleasure. He saw how she nodded to a traveler on the stairs, a young man who greeted her and walked on, and how she smiled for a while afterward. It was nothing. Felix knew that it was nothing, and yet it settled into him and stayed there. In the evening he asked her what she was thinking of. Marie said, nothing in particular. He asked further, with a persistence that was unpleasant even to himself, whether she was bored, whether she would rather be somewhere else, whether it was becoming too much for her to sit here, day after day, beside a sick man. Marie looked at him, startled, and said how he could think such a thing. She came to him and laid her head on his shoulder, and stayed like that until it grew dark. Felix stroked her hair and was calmed for an hour. But when she slept, he sat upright in bed and reckoned. 9 months, perhaps 8. And afterward she would sit here, on an evening like this one, and the crickets would be just as loud. The summer went, and with it went the lightness. They moved on to Lake Garda, where the air was more humid and the nights were sultry. Felix bore it worse than Murano, but he did not want to go back, and Marie did not contradict him. They rented rooms in a house by the water. From the terrace, one looked out over the lake, which lay still as tin in the mornings, and grew waves in the afternoons when the wind came from the north. Felix sat there in a wicker chair, a blanket over his knees even when it was warm, and watched the boats. He spoke now more often of dying, not complaining, but probing, as though feeling out an object. He said it was strange to know that one would not see the next winter. He said the worst thing was not death, but the certainty that everything else would go on. Marie listened and answered what she always answered, that she would go with him. She said it calmly and without pathos, the way one repeats a settled matter. At first Felix had been silent at this. Now he pressed her. He asked how she meant to do it, whether she had already thought about it. Marie grew pale and said she did not want to speak of it. Felix would not let go. He said it had been her own suggestion after all, and if she meant it seriously, then one must be allowed to speak of it aloud. Marie stood up and went into the house. In the evening they made up, as they always made up, but the rift was there, and both of them knew it. In the days that followed, Felix kept coming back to it, often in passing, in the middle of a harmless conversation. He mentioned a remedy he had read about, quick and painless. He said one need only choose the right moment. Marie heard it and was silent. Once she said she was with him after all, every day. She did everything, and whether that was not enough. Felix said that was something else. She asked what was different then. He answered that she could leave at any time. She had a door behind her, and he had none. Alfred wrote from Vienna. He asked after Felix's condition. He gave advice. He inquired after Marie. Felix read the letter twice and put it away. Later in the day, he asked Marie whether she was actually fond of Alfred. She said, of course, he was a good friend. Felix nodded and said nothing more. But in the night, he lay awake and thought of Alfred, who was young and healthy and who still had many years before him, and of Marie, who was 22 and likewise had many years before her. And the thought that these years might meet one another ate into him like acid. In the autumn, they returned to Vienna. The apartment had been cold and smelled of stale air, and Marie went from room to room and opened the windows. Felix stood in the doorway and watched her. She was still wearing her traveling coat. Her cheeks were reddened from the cold, and she moved quickly and surely through the rooms. He thought that she would be standing here when he was no longer there, in these rooms, at this window. The illness had grown worse. The cough now came in fits that shook him for minutes and left him exhausted afterward. He hardly went out anymore. Alfred came every other day, examined him, exchanged a few words with Marie in the anteroom, and went again. Felix heard these conversations through the closed door without understanding the words, and each time the suspicion grew in him that something was being discussed there that concerned him and from which he was being excluded. Once he asked Marie about it. She said Alfred had only asked about his medications. Felix said she had taken a long time for so short a piece of information. Marie looked at him and went into the kitchen without a word. The tone between them grew sharper. Felix made remarks that he himself hated even as he spoke them. He said she was looking well lately. He said it must be pleasant to be able to go out in the evenings still. He asked whether she had already considered what she would do with the apartment. Marie answered these things at first with patience, then with tears, and finally not at all. She withdrew into a quiet friendliness that irritated Felix even more than contradiction. On a November evening they sat by the light of the lamp, and Felix put aside the book in which he had not been reading. He said he wanted to speak with her about the vow. Marie said she was tired. He said it would not take long. Then he spoke calmly and in order, like one who has long since worked it out. He said he had thought it over, and he held it to be right that the two of them should go together, on the same day, at the same hour. He had already seen to the means. It lay in the desk. Marie stared at him. She asked whether he meant it seriously. Felix said she had promised it to him. She said she had said it in the park, on an evening when, out of fear, she had not known what she was saying. Felix nodded slowly and said, then it had been worth nothing. Marie stood up and left the room, and Felix remained seated and heard how in the next room a door closed. Winter came, and with it a narrowness that both of them could hardly bear any longer. Felix left the bed only for hours at a time. His face had grown hollow, his hands had become thin, and when he spoke he had to draw breath between the sentences. Marie went on caring for him, carefully and without complaint. But something had changed. She touched him only when it was necessary. She sat in the room without speaking. And Felix, who watched every one of her stirrings like a sentinel, saw it and read it rightly. The subject came up now almost daily. Sometimes he began gently, recalled the evening in the park, her words, her face as she spoke them. Sometimes he began coldly and totted up for her what she owed him. Marie resisted at first with reason. She said it did him no good, after all, if she died too. She said he was demanding something no person had the right to demand. Felix answered that he demanded nothing. She had offered it. Then she wept, and then she was silent. And in that silence there lay something he could not penetrate. Once, on an afternoon in January, it burst out of her. She stood at the window with her back to him and said that she was 22. She said it quietly, more to herself. Then she turned around and said it once more, aloud. She was 22 years old, and she wanted to live. Felix lay in bed and looked at her, and for a moment there was nothing in him but astonishment at the simplicity of that sentence. Then came the rage. He said she had sworn. She said she had sworn because she had loved him and because in that moment she had believed she could not breathe without him. Now she knew better. Felix asked whether she therefore no longer loved him. Marie said she loved him, and she would still not die. After that they spoke not a word to each other for 2 days. Marie slept in the next room. On the 3rd day, Alfred came, and Felix asked him to sit down. He asked him how much longer it would be. Alfred evaded. Felix insisted on an answer. Alfred said at last that it could be weeks. Felix nodded and thanked him. When Alfred had gone, Felix opened the drawer of the desk and looked at the small vial that had lain there since the autumn. He took it out, held it against the light, and put it back again. Then he called for Marie and told her she should prepare for the journey. She asked, which journey? He said, to the lake. He wanted to experience the spring there. They traveled at the end of February. Marie had not objected. Perhaps she hoped that the air would help him once more. Perhaps she only wanted to get out of the apartment, in which every room by now smelled of quarreling. The journey strained Felix terribly. Twice he had to lie down in the compartment, and in Verona he had a fit that lasted so long that a railway official wanted to fetch help. When they arrived at the lake, it was evening, and the mountains on the other side stood black against a greenish sky. The house was the same as in the summer, and the landlady recognized them again. She was startled when she saw Felix and hid it badly. Marie arranged the room, helped him into bed, and opened the window a crack. From outside came the sound of the water. Felix lay there and breathed shallowly and said it was good to be here. Marie sat down by the bed and stayed until he had fallen asleep. In the following days he was calmer than he had been in months. He did not speak of the vow. He spoke very little at all, and when he spoke, it was of small things, of a bird on the railing, of the color of the water in the morning. Marie took hope. She read aloud to him, she pushed his chair onto the terrace when the sun stood there, and once they both laughed at something the landlady had said. It was a short laugh, but it was the first in a long time. Then came the evening on which it turned. Marie had been downstairs to fetch water and had stayed away longer than necessary because she had stood a moment at the shore, alone, in the wind. When she came back, Felix was sitting upright in bed. He asked where she had been. She told him. He said she had taken a long time for a glass of water. Marie set the glass down and said she could not bear it any longer. And Felix, without raising his voice, said she would not have to bear it much longer either. That night Marie woke because something was moving in the room. The moon stood over the lake, and in its light she saw Felix. He was standing beside her bed. In one hand he held a glass, in the other, the vial. He bent over her, and his face was very close, and he said, very softly, that the time had come now. They had promised it after all. They should do it together. Marie lay still. Then she started up, thrust his arm aside, and screamed. The glass fell and shattered on the tiles. Felix staggered back against the wall, and a fit of coughing threw him to the floor. Marie fetched the landlady, and together they brought Felix back to bed. He was conscious, but he could barely speak. His gaze followed Marie through the room while she swept up the shards, and in that gaze there was nothing left of what had been there in the months before. No rage, no reproach, no craving, only a great, empty attentiveness. She put the vial into her pocket and went down with it to the water and threw it out. In the morning she sat again by his bed. She had not slept. Felix moved his hand and she took it. He said her name, and she said she was there. Then they both lay still, and outside the day began and the first boats went out. Toward noon, his breathing grew shallower. He looked toward the window where the light lay on the lake, and once he lifted his head a little, as though he wanted to say something. He did not say it. In the early afternoon he stopped breathing, and Marie noticed only when the room sounded different. She remained seated. She held his hand until it grew cold. The landlady came and went again. A doctor came. Papers were filled out. Marie did what had to be done, and she did it calmly. In the evening she stood at the open window. The mountains lay dark against the sky, and below the water beat against the stones. She felt the cool air on her face, and she breathed in deeply, and she noticed that she did it gladly. She noticed that she was hungry. She noticed that she was thinking of the next day, of the journey back, of things that had to be put in order. A horror went through her, and immediately afterward a relief that was stronger than the horror. She stood a long while yet at the window. Then she closed it and went downstairs. That was our short retelling of Dying by Arthur Schnitzler. Two people give each other in a moment of despair a promise that is greater than they are, and what comes afterward is the slow, painful road back to the truth. Life wants to live, even when it loves. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.